November 1941. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio. The cold wind off the Great Miami River rattled the windowpanes of Building 14 as Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin "Ben" Kelsey sat hunched over his desk. Staring at a telephone, he had no legal right to touch for what he was about to do. Wright Field was asleep. Only the faint hum of generators and the distant clatter of a night shift maintenance crew broke the silence. But Kelsey remained motionless, the icy glow of his desk lamp carving deep shadows across his face. He had kept secrets before. As one of the Air Corps' youngest engineering prodigies, secrecy came with the job covert aircraft projects, classified weapons trials, private briefings with Roosevelt's science advisors. But this was different. This wasn't a secret project. This wasn't a classified test. This was a felony under the Communications Act of 1934. And yet, he reached for the phone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For weeks, the Army and Navy had been drowning in encrypted Japanese diplomatic messages, thousands of pages of what the codebreakers called purple traffic. Japan's most sophisticated encryption system, brilliantly designed, painfully slow to break. The Navy's OP-20G and the Army's Signal Intelligence Service had achieved the impossible earlier that year, reconstructing purple with electromechanical wizardry. But decrypting Japan's traffic was still like drinking from a cracked faucet. Sometimes the flow was steady, sometimes it slowed to a drip, and sometimes often during the most important transmissions it simply stopped. It happened again that evening. Washington had detected an urgent purple message from Tokyo addressed to its embassy in Washington, D.C. It was long, delivered in multiple parts, and sent with higher priority than anything in the last 6 months. But the Army's decryption machine, one of only 4 in the entire world, was down for repairs. And Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Kelsey was the only man with access to the one person who might be able to help. Dr. Paul Ottens, the civilian engineer whose modifications to the Army's purple machines had boosted decryption speeds 5-fold, was the closest thing America had to a miracle worker in the world of code machines. Unfortunately, Ottens was also a civilian, and civilians were strictly forbidden from receiving foreign intercepts. But Kelsey didn't care about regulations tonight. He cared about the message. He cared about the urgency stamped across it. He cared about the timing late November, tensions at a breaking point. He cared about the instinct gnawing at his gut. Japan was preparing something. Kelsey opened his desk drawer and removed the top sheet of a folder marked with a red diagonal /TOP. Magic. He unfolded it carefully, scanning. The note handwritten by a signal intelligence courier 2 hours earlier, part 12 of 14 received. Embassy instructs destruction of certain codes and cipher machines. Urgency unusual. Tone severe. Possible imminent rupture of diplomatic relations. One line was underlined 3 times. Embassy instructed to prepare for action on December 1. December 1. 3 days from now. Kelsey exhaled slowly. 3 days wasn't enough time to relocate a fleet, redirect a carrier group, or even brief Congress. Whatever action meant, America's window to act was closing. His thoughts drifted again to the Japanese naval officer intelligence dismissed as irrelevant. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind strategist who had spent years studying America's industrial potential and advocating for a first strike if war came. Washington believed Yamamoto would attack the Philippines. Others whispered he planned something more ambitious. Kelsey's instincts leaned toward the whispers. He dialed the number anyway. 3 rings, a click, a groggy voice. Kelsey? Do you know what time it is? Paul, Kelsey said, lowering his voice despite the empty hallway outside. I need your help, and I need it now. On the other end, Doctor. Paul Ottens sat up in bed in his small government-issue apartment on the edge of the base. He rubbed his eyes, recognizing the tone in Kelsey's voice immediately. This wasn't about test schedules or component failures. This was about the war they all knew was coming. Is this About that traffic? Otens asked. Kelsey hesitated a dangerous pause. Yes, he said finally. Part 12 came in. Only fragments are translating. They're ordering destruction of code machines. Tokyo doesn't send that unless they're preparing to shut down diplomatic channels. Otens finished, suddenly fully awake. You know what that means. I do. A silence stretched between them, heavy, electric, illegal. Kelsey, Otens whispered, you can't tell me what's in the message. But I'm asking you how quickly we can restore the decryption machine to full operation. Is this a request, Colonel? Otens asked carefully. Or an order? It's neither, Kelsey said. Because this call isn't supposed to be happening. A faint, humorless laugh drifted through the receiver. Then I'll pretend I didn't hear it. Otens threw on his clothes and dashed through the frigid night toward Wright Field's communications annex. Floodlights cast long beams across the tarmac, illuminating rows of hangars where prototype fighters slumbered under tarps. Inside Building 7's secure room, the purple decryption machine sat disassembled across a workbench like a patient mid-surgery. Copper wiring, stepping switches, and rotor wheels sprawled across cloth sheets. A faint smell of ozone lingered. Otens needed 40 minutes, maybe 50. But he had never worked with Kelsey on anything that allowed for safety margins. He snapped on rubber gloves. He didn't bother with a coat. And he started to work. While Otens wrestled with the mechanical innards of the purple machine, 2,000 miles away, the corridors of the State Department were flooded with activity rare for midnight. Inside the Cryptology Center, Colonel Rufus Bratton, head of the Army's Far Eastern Intelligence Desk, stared at a decrypted portion of the same message Kelsey had seen. His fingers drummed the table. The Japanese embassy had begun burning documents earlier that day. The U.S. Embassy in Tokyo reported unusual troop movements. Signal intelligence reported Japan had instructed all ambassadors to read Part 14 at the exact same hour worldwide. Something enormous was coming, but the picture wasn't complete. Not without the missing parts. Otens twisted a locking ring into place. "Try it now," he shouted, across the room. A young sergeant flipped the breaker. The machine hummed. Purple lights flickered. The relays clicked like a typewriter possessed. Translation output began to spill line by line. Otens grinned despite himself. Beautiful. Like new. Then he heard the door open. Kelsey stepped inside, trench coat still damp from the night air. "How fast?" "Fast enough," Otens said. He paused. "But there's a problem." Kelsey stiffened. "Washington needs this machine running for the next 48 hours straight." Otens continued. "The load could fry the relay bank. We'd have to shut it down for maintenance." Kelsey walked over to the humming machine, placing a gloved hand on its casing. "Then don't shut it down. If the relays fail, let them fail." Otens stared at him. "Kelsey, this machine is the only one in the Midwest. If it burns out, we're blind." "We're blind already," Kelsey said. Washington's staring at a missing puzzle piece. "If this helps them find it in time, then it's worth the risk." Otens swallowed. "And if someone asks who authorized me to push it this hard, you tell them," Kelsey said. "It wasn't an order." 43 minutes later, the machine finished processing the intercepted transmission. A fresh sheet of paper slid onto the tray. Otens picked it up. It was only one paragraph, but it was the paragraph the Army had been waiting for. Otens read it silently, his face drained of color. "Good God." "Kelsey," he said, voice tight, "this is the final instruction. This is the conclusion to the entire 14-part message." Kelsey took the sheet, scanning the lines. Tokyo was instructing its embassy to break off diplomatic relations if the United States did not agree to all Japanese demands by 1 p. 2 m. Washington time on Sunday, December 7. Not December 1. December 7. And not action. Not preparation. War. Not explicitly stated, but plainly implied. Washington now had a ticking clock, a precise hour, a deadline that practically screamed impending conflict. But neither Kelsey nor Ottens were cleared to read this message. Possessing it, much less reading it, was a crime, and yet here it was, printed, legible, humming out of a machine that wasn't allowed to be operated by a civilian at this hour. Kelsey folded the sheet with trembling hands. "You didn't read this," he said. "I didn't read anything. You weren't here. I was asleep. And this machine," Kelsey said, "did not run after midnight." Ottens nodded as much to himself as to Kelsey. "Kelsey, what are you going to do?" "What I'm trained to do," Kelsey said. "Move information where it needs to go, before it's too late." Kelsey left the building with the folded sheet tucked into the inner pocket of his trench coat. The December wind sliced against his face as he crossed the airfield. He climbed into his government-issued Dodge and started the engine. He wasn't taking this to his superiors. They already believed war was possible, not imminent. He wasn't sending it to the War Department. They were bogged down in protocol. He wasn't sending it to the Navy. Inter-service rivalry slowed everything by hours. He was doing the unthinkable. He was going to send it directly to the White House map room, using an unofficial back channel used only during aviation emergencies. He drove through the deserted streets of Dayton until he reached the Western Union Station near the rail yard. A sleepy clerk looked up as he entered. "Midnight delivery? To Washington?" the clerk asked. "Priority code," Kelsey said, sliding identification across the counter. "Charge it to War Department contingency funds." The clerk hesitated when he saw the red diagonal slash. Then he nodded slowly. "How urgent?" Kelsey leaned forward. "In the last 20 years, he said. Nothing you've ever sent was more urgent than this." As Kelsey sped back to base, Ottens sat alone in the decrypted message room, staring at the machine. Something was bothering him. Not the illegality, not the risk, something else, timing. Why would Tokyo schedule its ultimatum to conclude at 1 p.m., Washington time? Ottens counted backwards. That was 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. He stood slowly. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a window, a target window. He wasn't an intelligence officer. He wasn't a military strategist. But even he could do that math. He whispered into the empty room. "Dear God, they're going to hit the Pacific." When Kelsey returned to Wright Field, the base was still dark. Only one room glowed with light. Ottens was waiting. "We need to call Washington again," Ottens said immediately. "I already sent the telegram." "No," Ottens said, stepping closer. "You don't understand. The timing." The phone rang. Both men jumped. Kelsey picked it up. "Lieutenant Colonel Kelsey." "Yes. This is Colonel Bratton at the War Department. I received something I believe came from your office." Kelsey felt his throat tighten. "Colonel," Bratton continued, "I need to know who authorized this transmission." Kelsey paused. Then he said, "No one, sir." A long silence followed. Then, "Lieutenant Colonel," Bratton said quietly, "you may have just saved us days of delay. Report to Washington at once. Bring any additional decrypts." The line went dead. Ottens stared at him. "What did he say?" "He said," Kelsey whispered, "that we're out of time." Mechanics filed in, unaware that the world had shifted while they slept. Kelsey stood outside, Building 7, watching the sun rise through the winter haze. He had just committed a crime that could destroy his career. But he had also done something else, something infinitely more important. He had accelerated the flow of intelligence that would reach the President, the Secretary of War, and the Pacific commanders in the critical last days before December 7. Whether they acted on it was out of his hands. But the truth, the raw signal Japan hoped would stay hidden, was on its way. And somewhere across the Pacific, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carrier strike force was racing silently toward Hawaii. The countdown had begun. The 26th of November 1941. Hitokapu Bay, Kuril Islands. Snow drifted across the volcanic cliffs as the cold Siberian wind knifed through the anchorage. The water was black, silent, almost unnaturally still. Beneath the mist, 7 steel giants waited motionless, lights darkened, boilers cold. They did not belong there, they were not meant to be seen there. And in a few hours, they wouldn't exist here at all. This was Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled in the history of naval warfare. 6 fleet, carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, 2 battleships, scores of cruisers and destroyers, 23 oilers, tenders, and support vessels, and 414 aircraft, hand-picked, trained beyond exhaustion, and briefed on a mission none of them dared name aloud. On the flagship Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the icy deck in a heavy greatcoat, his breath steaming in the sub-zero air. He gazed across the darkened fleet, knowing what this moment meant not only for Japan, but for his own life. The order had come down from Yamamoto himself. Proceed to Hawaiian waters, attack the American Pacific Fleet. There was no strategy left, no diplomacy, no turning back. Only the long, silent approach. 100 miles south aboard the battleship, Nagato, Yokosuka Naval Base. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his dim cabin, alone except for a single oil lamp flickering beside him. Though commander of the entire combined fleet, he would not lead the attack personally. Nagumo would take Kido Butai. But Yamamoto was the architect, the dreamer, the gambler. He knew the risks, he knew the consequences. He had studied in America, played poker in Harvard dormitories, walked the machine shops of Detroit, watched Ford assembly lines run like waterfalls of steel. He spoke English better than some of Roosevelt's own cabinet. And, because he knew America so intimately, he understood a truth Japanese leadership refused to face. If Japan and America fought a long war, Japan would lose. So the war had to be short, swift, crushing. Japan had to break America's spine before it could rise, and the only way to do that was to strike at the Pacific Fleet itself, a single, violent, overwhelming blow. Yamamoto closed his eyes and whispered not a prayer, but a warning to himself. If the war lasts longer than 2 years, I can guarantee victory to no one. But it was too late. The strike force was already leaving harbour. History had begun its irreversible slide toward catastrophe. Back in Hitokapu Bay, midnight came like a hammer. The signal flags rose across the fleet. Engines roared to life, shattering the frozen silence. Columns of white water erupted behind the destroyers as they slipped out into the night. One by one, the carriers dragged their black silhouettes into the Pacific, each ship following the other in ghostly formation. The Japanese fleet left in total radio silence. No transmissions, no lights, no navigation beacons. Even the crew were forbidden from writing letters that could hint at their movements. For the next 11 days, Kido Butai would move like a phantom across the North Pacific, hidden beneath cloud cover, avoiding commercial shipping lanes, zigzagging to avoid detection by Soviet trawlers. It was the most ambitious stealth operation ever attempted in naval history, but it was only possible because of the secrecy Japan had maintained for months, and because America, despite cracking Japan's diplomatic cipher, had not yet cracked Japan's naval code JN-25. Kido Butai had vanished into the fog of war. November 27, War Department, Washington, D.C. Colonel Rufus Bratton slammed a stack of decrypts onto his desk. He had slept 2 hours in the last 36. The message Kelsey had illegally forwarded from Ohio, the one labelled Part 14, was now causing chaos throughout the War Department. Officers sprinted between rooms, secretaries typed until their fingers blistered. Generals argued behind closed doors. Everyone knew war was imminent. No one knew where. Bratton turned to his aide. "Has the Navy sent their assessment yet?" "Still waiting, sir." Bratton cursed under his breath. The Army was convinced Japan would strike the Philippines. The Navy was convinced they would strike Thailand or Malaya. The British were convinced they would strike Singapore. And the intelligence analysts, those who had seen the timing embedded in Japan's encrypted dispatches, feared the Pacific Fleet could be a target. But no one wanted to say it aloud, because saying it out loud meant confronting a possibility too terrifying to accept, that Japan had the capability to cross 3,500 miles of open ocean undetected. The Navy considered it impossible. The Army considered it improbable. Washington considered it too far-fetched to distract resources. Only a handful of men believed it was not only possible, but likely. Benjamin Kelsey was one of them. Kelsey arrived in Washington on the morning of November 28, exhausted, cold, and still unsure whether he would be thanked or court-martialed. He was ushered directly into a secure room on the second floor of the munitions building. Bratton stood waiting. "You took a risk," Bratton said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" Kelsey inhaled. "Because the message you were missing wasn't just important, it was the foundation of the entire Japanese timetable. Without it, our picture of December is distorted. With it, a pattern emerges." Bratton gestured for him to continue. "Tokyo wants the ultimatum delivered at 1 p.m., Washington time. That timing aligns with dawn across the Pacific. They want synchronized ruptures. They want confusion." "Confusion for what purpose?" "To mask movement," Kelsey said. "To mask an attack." Bratton folded his arms. "You believe this is Pearl Harbor, don't you? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Kelsey hesitated. "Yes," he said. "I do." Bratton stared at him, then slowly nodded. "You're not the only one. November 28, Honolulu, territory of Hawaii, inside the U.S. Navy's small intelligence unit on Oahu. A young warrant officer named Joseph Rochefort pored over scraps of Japanese naval intercepts, frustrated, exhausted, and deeply aware of one glaring truth. They were missing something. Something big. JN 25, the Japanese Naval Operational Code, had recently changed. Half the old patterns no longer made sense. Rochefort and his team could read fragments, sometimes phrases never full meaning. He could see increased radio silence among Japanese carriers. He could see spikes in encrypted traffic from Tokyo. But without enough deciphered additive tables, he couldn't see the one thing he needed most, the location of Kido Butai. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. What he didn't know, what no one in Hawaii knew, was that the Japanese carriers were no longer transmitting. They had gone dark the moment they left Hitokapu Bay. The biggest clue in the Pacific was the absence of signals. But absence wasn't a reportable intelligence item. Not yet. On the carrier Shokaku, Commander Minoru Genda, the attack's tactical mastermind, stood before a room of elite aviators. 24-year-olds. 26-year-olds. Men who had flown over China. Men who had strafed Chongqing. Men who had trained for a strike they themselves didn't fully understand. The projector clicked as Genda showed the final reconnaissance sketches of Pearl Harbor, painstakingly recreated from a Japanese spy posing as a Honolulu photographer. "The American battleships anchor here," he said, pointing to Battleship Row. "The carriers, if present, will be moored nearby or underway at sea." A pilot raised his hand. "What if the American carriers are not in harbor?" Genda paused. "Then," he said quietly, "we may win the battle and lose the war." The room fell silent. Everyone knew the carriers were the true threat. Battleships were political trophies. Carriers were annihilation machines. Everything hinged on catching the American carriers in port. Everything. And no one aboard Shokaku knew the brutal irony. None of the American carriers were in Pearl Harbor. Enterprise was returning from Wake. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego. Japan's strike force would soon deal a devastating blow, but not the decisive one Yamamoto had hoped for. Tokyo, November 29. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo received a terse update from the Foreign Ministry. The American response to Japan's final proposal was negative. Roosevelt refused to recognize Japan's claims in China. Negotiations were effectively dead. Tojo stared at the paper. Then he whispered, "Then all that remains is war." He approved Operation Z. The die was cast. From November 30 to December 3, Kido Butai plunged deeper into the Pacific. The weather became their ally, towering storm walls, curtains of sleet, unbroken cloud cover. Japanese lookouts reported no ships, no aircraft, no radios detected. It was as if the North Pacific had emptied itself to let them pass. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous the mission became. The fleet had to refuel 3 times mid-ocean. Destroyers struggled as waves smashed over their decks. Aircraft crews practiced launching in gale-force winds. And all the while, the Americans remained unaware that the largest carrier strike force ever assembled was sliding directly toward their most important naval base, hidden by nature, shielded by weather. Guided by a timetable born of encrypted messages the Americans were still piecing together. December, one Army Intelligence Center Colonel Bratton burst into an office where General George Marshall's staff were drafting routine memos. "I need these distribution lists updated," Bratton said. "I need the Pacific commanders to receive warning no." 3. Immediately. What kind of warning? A potential attack, possibly coordinated, possibly within the next 6 days. You have confirmation? No, Bratton admitted, not confirmation, but the indicators are undeniable. There's no authorization to send a war warning without the Chief of Staff's signature. Then, get it. But Marshall was meeting with advisors, discussing the Philippines, debating diplomatic collapse, and as the message sat on a desk awaiting approval, Kido Butai continued racing across the Pacific. The window was closing. On the night of December 2, a coded message reached the strike force. Niitaka Yama Nobore. Climb Mount Niitaka. It was the final go code. The attack was authorized. War was now not just inevitable, it was scheduled. Thousands of miles away aboard Nagato, Yamamoto received confirmation. He walked to the darkened deck and stared out across Tokyo Bay. He knew what would follow. He had predicted it in letters years earlier. If Japan goes to war with America, I will run rampant for 6 months. After that, I can guarantee nothing. He feared he had just set the clock ticking. December 3-5, North Pacific. The Japanese fleet turned southeast toward Hawaii. Pilots wrote wills. Mechanics double-checked every torpedo, every Zero fighter, every dive bomber. Deck crews practiced launching waves of aircraft in complete blackout conditions. On Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who would lead the attack, studied reconnaissance photos under dim lights. He memorized mooring patterns, refueling schedules, defense layouts, anti-aircraft positions. Every detail mattered, every second mattered. But he also knew something no report could confirm: whether Pearl Harbor's defenses were sleeping or waiting for them. Washington, December 5. The War Department finally issued an alert. Hostile action possible at any moment. It went to the Philippines, it went to Panama, it went to the British in Singapore. But the message sent to Hawaii was softened, rephrased by a cautious officer who feared causing panic or misinterpretation. Instead of imminent attack, the final wording suggested subversive activities and sabotage. No one warned Pearl Harbor to expect an air raid. No one warned them about Dawn. No, one warned them about carriers. The most important warning of the war was diluted into bureaucratic mush, and Kido Butai moved closer. December 6, Oahu. The sky over Pearl Harbor glowed orange as the sun set behind the Waianae Range. Sailors played cards, wrote letters home, attended band concerts. Officers went to the cinema in Honolulu. Marines lounged on the decks of battleships moored peacefully along Battleship Row. It was the last day of peace any of them would ever know. At the same hour, in Washington, linguists struggled to finish decoding a long diplomatic message from Tokyo. It was part 14. The final instruction. The same message Kelsey had risked his career to reveal days earlier. The message that declared Japan would break relations the next day. General Marshall prepared to send a warning finally. But he did not use a military priority channel. He sent it by commercial Western Union. The message arrived in Honolulu after the attack began. At 2,200 hours on, December 6, aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo received the last weather report. Visibility over Oahu, ideal. American reconnaissance, negligible. Defensive posture, relaxed. Nagumo gave the order. Kido Butai turned south toward Hawaii. Flight crews woke their squadrons. Bombs were loaded, torpedoes armed, engines tested. Commander Fuchida climbed to the observation deck and saw the moonlit ocean stretching endlessly before them. He whispered to a junior officer, "Tomorrow, we will change the world." Benjamin Kelsey sat in a Washington dormitory, staring at a coffee-stained table, unable to sleep. Something gnawed at his mind, a pressure he couldn't shake. He had pushed the warning forward. He had accelerated the intelligence cycle. He had done everything a man in his position could do. But as he stared at the silent phone, he couldn't escape the sense that time had already run out. That somewhere in the darkness of the Pacific, something enormous was moving. Something no one would be able to stop. He didn't know it yet. But in just a few hours, the radio silence he had feared most would be broken not by intercepts, but by the first explosions over Battleship Row. Pre-dawn darkness clung to the Hawaiian Islands like a wet shroud. Out in the Pacific, long before the first glow of sunrise touched the Ko'olau Range, the USS Ward ploughed a white V-shape through the Black Sea. The destroyer's boilers throbbed like a pulse. Lookouts scanned the water with the desperate intensity that came only after weeks of false alarms, incomplete intelligence, and the creeping dread that something was closing in on Oahu. Lieutenant William Outerbridge, commanding the Ward on only his second day, stood on the bridge with his collar up and binoculars welded to his eyes. The night wind bit through his uniform, but he barely noticed. He had been warned. Not officially, not through channels, not via any message stamped most secret, magic, but from an obscure Army Air Corps officer on the mainland who had no authority to warn anyone, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Kelsey. The phone call was not recorded. No transcript existed. And yet, the words had etched themselves into Outerbridge's memory as though carved with a knife. Expect an attempt at a surprise attack, possibly involving submarines, possibly soon. If anything seems off, anything at all, you act first. It was the single most illegal thing Kelsey had ever done, and it had reached the one man who needed to hear it. Now, on this cold, starless morning, that seed of suspicion was the only reason Outerbridge remained glued to the horizon, instead of relaxing into the usual pre-breakfast routine that had dulled vigilance across the fleet. The Pacific remained smooth and black, until it wasn't. A lookout's voice cracked through the wind. "Sir! Object in the water, port bow. Looks like a periscope, no, a conning tower." Outerbridge spun toward the dark mass. A small shape, barely visible, knifed toward the entrance of Pearl Harbor. Not a whale, too linear, too fast, and the wrong direction entirely. A chill slid into his bones. A submarine. A tiny one. Someone near him whispered, "Christ." A midget sub. Outerbridge didn't hesitate. The classified briefing Kelsey had referenced, the one he technically should not even have known existed, spoke of exactly this threat. He lifted the ship's phone. "General quarters. Load the forward guns." The bridge flared with sudden energy. Men scrambled. Boots thundered across steel decks. Ammunition handlers swung open lockers. Gun crews braced as the destroyer came alive around them. Outerbridge issued the order with a clarity grounded in fear sharpened into resolve. "Open fire." At 6:37 a.m., the Ward's No. 1 4-inch gun boomed thunder across the water. The shell streaked through the dim light, trailing sparks, and struck the midget submarine squarely at the conning tower. A fountain of water and metal erupted. The sub jerked sideways like a toy kicked by a giant. The war had begun, even if the rest of the island still slept. Before the splash had even settled, Outerbridge barked, "Fire again!" The second shot missed, geysering water behind the still-moving sub. The Ward heeled as she accelerated. Machine guns chattered from the deck, their tracer rounds stitching the surface around the sub. The enemy vessel tried to dive. Too late. The ward's depth charges thundered into the ocean. 1, 2, 3 erupting pillars of water lifted skyward, and the small submarine vanished from sight. Outerbridge exhaled the first breath he'd taken in nearly a minute, and then reality struck. He had fired without orders. He had sunk a foreign submarine. And Washington, disconnected, slow-moving, decentralized Washington, had no idea what he had seen. He turned to his radioman. "Send the message. We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon one submarine operating in defensive sea area." Outerbridge stood frozen as the radioman tapped it out into the void. He could only hope anyone understood what that meant. He did everything he could, and he had done it because an engineer on the mainland had dared to break the rules. At Army headquarters, the dispatcher receiving the ward's message frowned at the sheet of paper curling from the teleprinter. He walked it to the duty officer. "Sir, the ward is claiming hostile contact." The duty officer rubbed his eyes. "A hostile submarine? That can't be right. It's what they reported. Do they say it's Japanese?" "No, sir." The officer sighed, annoyed he had been forced to wake up this early over another possible sighting. "Well, we don't want to start a war over a misread whale. Send it up the chain." Up the chain it went, slowly, politely, bureaucratically. By the time it reached Admiral Kimmel's chief of staff, precious minutes had bled away. On the surface, the message was clear, but without context, without the illegally transmitted warning that Kelsey had whispered to Outerbridge, it read like dozens of earlier false alarms. The chief of staff stared at it, groggy and irritated. "Probably a false report." "Again," he muttered. He placed the message on the corner of his desk to deal with later. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Kelsey sat in his Wright Field office in Dayton, Ohio, hands clasped, unable to shake the crushing tension he had been carrying for weeks. He had made the call. He had broken military law. He had warned the one person willing to listen. But now, what? Kelsey had no official access to Hawaii's radar alerts, no direct reports from Pacific Fleet, no channel through which he could check whether his unofficial whisper had mattered. He only knew that Enigma intercepts indicated something would happen soon, something big, something coordinated, something that had left Japan strangely silent for nearly 10 days. The Navy's silence in response to his multiple memos had been deafening. And so he waited, a man who had committed a career-ending breach of protocol, staring at his desk, unable to control events he had tried desperately to influence. The phone remained silent. Kelsey couldn't shake the dreadnought tightening in his stomach. Something was about to break. The blip that could have changed history, ***, on the northern tip of Oahu, the mobile CR-270 radar station hummed quietly as two operators scanned the early morning clutter. Private George Elliott leaned forward. "Hey! Joe? You seeing that?" Private Lockhart adjusted the scope. The green phosphor sweep revealed a massive cluster of blips, a formation larger than anything either man had seen. "Holy hell," Lockhart whispered. "That's, what, 50? More? 60, maybe more." They watched in mounting disbelief. This wasn't a training, flight. This wasn't an accidental drift of weather. This was a wall of aircraft. Elliott reached for the phone. He called the intercept center at Fort Shafter. A sleepy voice answered. Lieutenant Tyler speaking. "Sir, we're tracking a large formation coming in from the north. Very large, bearing 343 degrees. Tyler frowned. "What time is it?" 0702, sir. "Probably the B-17 seconds expected from the mainland," Tyler mumbled. "Don't worry about it. But, sir, thank you, Private. Good work. Go get breakfast." The line clicked dead. Elliott stared at the receiver. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Lockhart swallowed hard. "We should call back, right? I mean, they should know." Elliott nodded. "Yes, but they won't listen." The green blips continued marching toward Oahu with cold inevitability. North of Oahu, the Japanese First Air Fleet, the Kido Butai, cut through the Pacific wind like 6 floating fortresses. Above them, 183 aircraft had already launched and now descended into attack formation. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood in the lead bomber, goggles frosting, breath short. He had waited his entire career for this moment, the strike that would cripple the American Pacific Fleet before it ever left port. A strike crafted in secrecy, honed with fanatical precision, rehearsed until every man could perform his role blindfolded. Fuchida's radio man tapped his shoulder. No resistance, no intercept aircraft, nothing. Fuchida nodded slowly, just as expected. The Americans were asleep. The element of surprise had held. He tightened his harness and gripped the flare pistol that would signal the attack. Below them, Pearl Harbor lay shrouded in the soft glow of early morning, peaceful, unsuspecting, utterly unprepared. The moment of realization, Outerbridge, paced the Ward's Bridge, still unnerved by the silence from headquarters. He knew he had sunk a hostile submarine. Kelsey's warning echoed in his mind. Act first. Act without hesitation. They had. And nothing had happened. No confirmation. No alert. No mobilization. The horizon looked calm, too calm. Then the sky to the north rippled with movement. Outerbridge raised his binoculars, expecting patrol aircraft, maybe even those same B-17 seconds he had heard were inbound. He froze. Dark shapes. Dozens of them. More. They were not American. They were not friendly. And they were coming fast. His voice cracked through the ship like a gunshot. Enemy aircraft. This is an air attack. But before he could raise the radio, the first bombs fell on Battleship Row. The day the world changed. Fuchida fired his flare into the sky. 2, 2, 2. Charge, charge, charge. The attack erupted with apocalyptic ferocity. Dive bombers plunged from the heavens. Torpedo planes skimmed the harbor's surface with deadly precision. High-altitude bombers released their loads like rain from a thunderstorm. The USS Arizona erupted in a fireball that split the sky, scattering debris across the harbor like burning meteors. The USS Oklahoma rolled onto her side. The USS California sank slowly into the mud. Anti-aircraft gunners, many half-dressed, many firing from the hip, scrambled to respond. Shells burst uselessly in the air as the first wave ravaged its targets. The second wave was already inbound. The island shook under the roar of hundreds of engines. The war had reached America in a single, shattering instant. The phone that would break Ben Kelsey's heart, the first notifications began trickling into Army channels in Washington. Enemy aircraft. Major damage. Losses unknown. Someone at the War Department called Wright Field, looking for Kelsey. He answered on the first ring. Lieutenant Colonel Kelsey speaking. Static. Voices. Chaos. Then finally. Pearl Harbor is under attack. Kelsey went deathly still. Not because he was surprised. Not because he was shocked. But because it meant one thing. His warning, the one thing he had risked everything to deliver, had not been enough. The machinery of bureaucracy had smothered it, and now thousands were paying the price. He lowered the phone and sat in silence, trembling with rage and grief. As smoke rose from the harbor, men aboard the Ward felt their stomachs twist. They had known, they had seen, they had acted, and no one had listened. Outerbridge whispered, almost to himself, God. The sky burned orange over Oahu as the Japanese fleet swept past, hunting for more targets. Outerbridge's crew stood at their guns, shaken but unbroken, knowing they had fired the first shots of the Pacific War, and knowing those shots had been swallowed by the machinery of indifference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.